Anybody ever heard of Goya, Francisco de Goya, the artist? Okay, cool. So we'll look at a few of his pieces. Most of what I'm going to be showing you today is Caravaggio. I'm going to show you one Da Vinci piece. Da Vinci wasn't a very prolific artist. He didn't make a lot of art, but what he did make was pretty killer. Okay, so you're capturing 5 interesting facts. If you don't know the definition of contrast, you should. It's really simple. Range of light, dark, and a composition, black, grayscale, and white. Everything we do in this class, with the exception of the final, is going to be black and white, right? So it's like we're always working with contrast in some way, shape, or form. But with chiaroscuro, it's an effect of contrasted light. So the light should fall unevenly or from a particular direction. A lot of times I use the word spotlight when I'm talking about chiaroscuro. And you'll see what I mean when we talk about this, right? Anybody familiar with Caravaggio, the artist? Right on. So his full name is Michelangelo de Merici Caravaggio. And so I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. I try not to make my art history stuff boring, and that's why Caravaggio is one of my favorites, because he's not boring. Like he could be on like some reality TV shows up in here. Like that's how much tea and drama he has about him, or had about him, as it were. So make sure you've got this vocabulary up in here. And I'll be giving you a lot of information later on. It's only a 14 or 15 slide thing. So I like to keep it, to the point, right? I also really don't like to put a lot of information up here with imagery, because here's what I've discovered educational psychology-wise. You all spend your time copying the information. You don't look at the work. And I want you to look at the work, because that's the most important thing that we're doing today. Excuse me. So I hope you all have this. If not, I can come back to it. You will get used to my pace. Okay, so Da Vinci's piece here, you may be familiar with it. It's considered one of his masterpieces, the Madonna of the Rocks work, 1483. To me, the most important and interesting part of the composition is this zoom in right here with this figure. So I remember when I saw this in art history for the first time, I was really impressed with the lighting situation and just the ultimate realism that I saw in this stuff, because I had been in medieval before that class, Renaissance Baroque, and medieval everything was really flat and there wasn't a lot of detail and just realism happening. So zooming in on this, you can really see that chiaroscuro element. The light is coming from one direction, or kind of like an above left direction, really bathing her face on that side and dropping some pretty intense shadows on the other side. So we get this almost sculptural sensibility about it, right? I've talked about Da Vinci's work before. We talked about the Mona Lisa and how sfumato is in there. He used a lot of sfumato in his work, and that's one of those kind of moody, kind of theatrical characteristics. Again, Italian. We break that down. Fumo basically means smoke. So we talk about atmospheric perspective, right? When there's more atmosphere between us and the stuff in the negative, or not negative space, but in this case, background space, we see less and less of that detail. So Da Vinci was definitely a master of that. So I just like to start with his work here, just to kind of identify what chiaroscuro looks like. So this would be Goya. So he was a Spanish artist, right? Kind of some interesting stories about his work. This piece is called the 2nd of May, 1808, but it was painted in 1815. So this is basically a depiction of when Napoleon made an alliance with the King Charles of Spain, and his whole idea was like, hey, let's group up, we'll be homies. And he's like, well, why do you want to do that? Wait, they didn't talk this way, by the way. Okay. Like, hey, what do you want to do that? Well, I really want to conquer Portugal, and I need to get through your country to get to Portugal. And he's like, hey, that sounds good. We'll be an alliance. It sounds awesome. So what happened was Napoleon and his French army start cooking through Spain, and they're thinking, oh, they're just going to come all the way through. But he lied to them. His intentions were to actually conquer Spain and take it over, which is what he did. And he made his brother the king of Spain. So I'm trying to remember what his brother's name is. I think it's a really normal name, like Brian or something. But let's see. I know I wrote it down up in here. It's a lot to remember, man. Joseph Bonaparte. So he became the king of Spain. So there was a whole bunch of of Spanish freedom fighters that got together, and they were like, we're not gonna take this sitting down, right? So they revolt, okay? And that's what you're seeing here, right? You're seeing kind of like this crazy like fighting scene thing. We see that sfumato happening in this work as well, right? That atmospheric perspective, the stuff that's coming close to us, we can see a lot of detail with that. But there is some chiaroscuro elements here as well. So identifying that, right? Just take a quick look. Compositionally, where do you see the most uneven lighting, kind of almost spotlight effect happening in this piece? Like, just describe it. Subject matter wise.
I'd say the horse.
Yeah, the horse is like the perfect depiction of that, right? That musculature is unevenly lit, so it gives this sense of theater, right? When we look back, we can see this like other like black horse behind here, and that's kind of lit in a similar manner. The figures, they have some of that as well, like especially this figure over here that looks like he's kind of hiding behind that white horse. And again, that kind of realism, as it were. So the 3rd of May, 1808, right? So this it's a very important work. You've probably seen it. It's cropped in just a little bit. There's a little bit more information on the side here. So when the Spanish freedom fighters were captured, right? They were all massacred. They were executed, okay? And this piece really, like I remember seeing this one in art history as well and thinking, wow, what a departure from like that whole idea of basic realism, where our figure here, who's kind of like surrendering, is so bright compared to everything else. So that contrast is like a thing that really catches me. So it's no doubt about where the emphasis is. When I was reading about this, it was interesting that a lot of historians believe this is the first modern painting, because it's kind of like a departure from a lot of realism and becoming a little bit more expressionistic, right? Because Goya made the choice to really highlight this victim and create this almost kind of like martyrdom kind of situation. So some more expressionistic aspects to that. So Goya was known for his use of chiaroscuro, as well as Da Vinci, and Caravaggio as well. So de Goya was he was a printmaker by and large, and a lot of his work was a detail of a lot of the war that he experienced when he lived in Spain. Okay, so Caravaggio, one of my favorite artists of all time. I'm going to show you several key pieces. He was highly prolific as an artist. So 1602 here, Deposition of Christ. So just kind of talking about some of the spatial devices happening here. We have a really short space thing happening in the bottom with some linear perspective, but that figure, that Christ figure, is so like brilliantly lit versus the negative space being like this deep saturated black that just kind of like sucks up and absorbs all the light, and all these really dramatic poses. You'll see in a lot of his work, almost all of his work, it seems like, has this sort of like red drapery thing going on. It's kind of like one of his signatures as an artist. So Caravaggio has kind of an interesting story, and I'll tell a lot more about that later, because I want to talk about the stuff that we see in here, right? He, like a lot of other high Renaissance artists, he's considered more of a Baroque artist, so this would be after high Renaissance. You're going to see depictions of biblical stories, like almost exclusively. He did do a lot of self-portraits and things like that, but things like the Deposition of Christ, Martyrdom of St. Matthew, those kind of things, he was still sort of working in that same idea of working basically for the Catholic Church, right? Anybody have any understanding of like the Protestant Revolution, like the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, that kind of stuff? So he was more of a Counter-Reformation artist, right? So he was tapped by the Catholics to try to bring more excitement back into art and make it to where people were more drawn to this work, right? So his style was like, it was hot to these patrons. And so he was really, really well supported, but he had to do some weird things to get there. One of the things about this piece that really captures me is that hand hovering right behind Jesus' head. Like, we only see the details we really need of that hand. to me, that kind of like mysterious, almost kind of theatrical look kind of makes Jesus like pop a lot more, right? With all of the lighter aspects of the figure. That hand coming down and kind of like touching this, I don't know, this big like block or whatever that kind of platform is. I mean, I feel like that really reaches into the viewer's space really well. Anybody ever seen this piece before? This is a pretty famous work. Yes, no, maybe? Okay. So, Calling of St. Matthew, and this is one of the, like if you were to look up Chiaroscuro, this would be like there, right? Because the spotlight technique is happening, right? Like straight through here. Okay? This idea that St. Matthew was being called out, and he was kind of like hiding out in the, I believe it was House of Emmaus. I'm not totally sure about that. I'd have to go back and read a little bit more. But the fact that we don't see a lot of detail up in here, but we see the striking light hitting these gentlemen right here, and this individual's kind of like hiding his face, you know, like, oh, don't take me. I always think about this when I think about Caravaggio in terms of like that spotlight type effect. That's kind of what we're going for with this project. Anybody ever seen this one? This is pretty famous work too. Kind of an interesting piece, David with the head of Goliath, and I didn't label it Caravaggio because that's all we're looking at from now on, okay? 1605. So again, biblical stories going on. A lot of historians have said that they think that this portrait right here, the beheaded Goliath, is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio. And if you look at that and you compare it to some of his self-portraits, you'll see a likeness there. But the detail and stuff in this is just so beautiful. You can see like where David smacked him in the head with that, you know, with this sling. He always went over the top and like, again, kind of theater style when it comes to the blood aspect. I kind of get this like, this almost like Tarantino type effect when it comes to the violence in his work. And he seemed to be really drawn to those types of stories. Like when I look at his work, I get that animus. I understand why he was choosing to depict these kinds of things. Okay, St. Jerome in Meditation. This is another really famous work of his. So you'll see St. Jerome a lot of times with some of the symbols that sort of connect him with that idea of the frailty of life. So you will see a skull almost always with him. And the idea is that he's kind of contemplating life and death and the frailty of our very short period of time on this planet. One of the little details that I remember looking at here and really being drawn to is that very faint gold halo up in there. You can almost not even see it, right? So signifying him as a saint, and way different than what we saw in High Renaissance and Renaissance, because those halos were like boom, big, and they were highly symbolic. But here it's like this tiny little, like, you know, almost Easter egg, right? That he's making sure to symbolize. And again, we see that drapery stuff going on. But that light coming from this direction, a lot of his face and his body being bathed in that darkness creates that more theatrical kind of mood, and kind of creates that nice effect of chiaroscuro. Okay, so Dionysus, Bacchus, right? So within mythology, being kind of the god of wine, livelihood, partying, all that kind of stuff. This is actually a self-portrait of him showing the sick Bacchus, because he was either like really lively, shown in like art history, or he's like kind of hungover like this, which is kind of how I think of it. So the story kind of goes that Caravaggio was really, really sick with malaria, and he was hospitalized for a while. And so when he got out, he was still like really like feverish and kind of gross and all that stuff. He'd be quarantining today, right? He would not be allowed to like go out and hang out with people and paint. He had like these nasty yellowish eyes, you know, his face was like really mottled and gross. He actually looked in the mirror to paint this, is what everybody kind of thinks in terms of the history. So I always found it kind of interesting how he inserted himself in a lot of the work. Okay, so this one has a pretty interesting story. Anybody ever seen this one? Yes, no, maybe? Quick question though, right? What are you drawn to first in this composition? There's a lot going on, right? So emphasis, any of you? Go for it.
It's either the girl like laying on the bed in like the red dress, or the girl lying that's like sitting next to her. It looks like she's grieving.
Yeah, kind of like weeping, right? Anybody else have a different emphasis going on up in here? Or is it pretty much established that that's the first place we look?
Those are the red drapery at the top.
Okay. Yeah, so you kind of see this motif or this style, this stylistic fluency going on. And again, it wasn't very common for works that were commissioned by the Catholic Church for these artists to be throwing their own style into it. And we kind of see that with Caravaggio. The idea was that it was really supposed to serve more of as a propaganda and a decoration type thing than it is about, oh, look at this artist, we're going to celebrate him. Just imagine Kanye if he was working for the Catholic Church, right? He'd be like, no, I got to throw my own style in this thing, and we're going to mix it up with Caravaggio. We're going to do it, okay, whatever. Anybody hear that Kanye changed his name to Ye? Yeah, see, that'd be like Caravaggio being like, you're asking me to take my red drapery out of here? I don't think so. It's going to happen every time. So this one has a really interesting story. Something that kind of upset the church, or some of the more traditional members of the church, was that Caravaggio often would paint from real life, and he needed models, right? So he would paint prostitutes because they're available, and that's kind of how it works. This person is not a prostitute. However, this has a story that is kind of affiliated with it. After he had finished the painting and he started showing it, some people understood and realized who this person was because the portrait was so realistic. And it was a woman that had drowned in a river, and they didn't know where she was. So people believe that Caravaggio pulled this body out of the river, hauled her back to his studio, set her up, and the high realism that we see here and the fact that she's bloated and kind of decomposing is a real observation that he was making. So yeah, his work is so real because he did as much as he could to try to get people that he was associated with. A lot of times they were drunk people that he would hang out in the bar with. And some people got upset about that too, because they're like, that kind of messes up the whole concept and purity of the Catholic Church happening here. But that's one of the reasons that his work was so realistic. And the cool thing about him was that he painted fast. He didn't labor over a piece for a long time. The idea was that if he brought in a model, he wanted to get that piece done quickly enough that model could then take off. Or in this case, he could spend a little more time because she actually did. And probably would start smelling up the studio. He would actually, some of the accounts of this are writings by art historians say that he would sometimes go on these painting binges to where he would just paint for 2 weeks straight and deprive himself of food and sleep and all this stuff. Or in a case of a really large singular painting, he would stay up for a couple, 3 days and just really go after this one work. So he kind of had this weird obsessive kind of nature with his work that I found to be really cool and interesting. Okay, this one has an interesting story to it too. The lute player. So, okay, this one's kind of hard for me to remember, so I'm gonna kind of jog my memory here. So after he painted this and he brought this thing out, a lot of people were really kind of flummoxed or confused by what gender was supposed to be displayed here. Okay. Because people thought that this person looked youthful, looked kind of feminine, they expected to see breasts. There's no breasts, right? So people were like, okay, that's not correct. It must be a younger boy kind of thing. And I want to make sure I get this right, so I have to go back to my notes here. Player. Yeah, they're like, okay, is it male or female? It must be androgynous. And it turns out that this individual was likely what they call a castrati, individuals that were castrated at young age. I don't know why. It's weird, okay? I didn't really go into all that. But in this culture, they were famous for their beautiful voices because if they were boys and they were castrated, they never developed that hormonal, deep voice thing. And they still had a youthful appearance. They didn't grow beards, that kind of thing. They were hairless. And a lot of times they had a weird kind of swollen face or something. Not sure why, but I'm really interested, and I'm probably going to research over the weekend because I was like, wow, that's strange. I want to know why that was a cultural custom. So I was like, man, that's nuts. I gotta get into that one. But again, in Caravaggio's style. Okay, there's the self-portrait, right? This is where I have a lot of stuff to tell you. Stuff that I have to write down because there's so much crazy stuff about this dude's life, right? So we'll start with like when he was orphaned. Okay, so when he was born, the bubonic plague was huge. The Black Death was killing people off like crazy. So his grandparents and his father, right? Yeah, they were killed within, or they died from, or succumbed to the bubonic plague within 6 years. So he was like 6 years old. Then the only person he had in his life was his mother. About 6 years later, she died. So he was orphaned. So he's 12 years old, right? Brings me to this apprenticeship concept. He was kind of drawn to drawing and painting, just like naturally. And so they hooked him up with an apprentice. So that concept of how art education worked back in Renaissance times, Baroque times, was that you didn't go to an academy or anything like that. You went with some kind of a master artist who is going to take on an apprentice. So he started studying from a very young age, and he was like this virtuoso. Like he painted quick, he drew quick, he could see really well. Not innately talented, but he was primed for that. He had probably those brain skills that helped him out with that. So when he came up in style, the words Baroque and Tenebrism kind of being after the High Renaissance, he had a lot of following. So there are actually people that are termed like Caravagistes, which basically means that they make art in the style of Caravaggio after he had died. Anybody heard about his short temper? This is kind of an interesting thing about him. So he worked quick, he's got this like fervent attitude on life, right? But it starts in a very, very, very interesting way. I'm gonna go back and be like, okay, he only lived to 38, right? We get that, it's a long time ago or whatever, but he could have lived longer, but he was like a really reckless person. So I told you about how he binged nights and weeks at a time, that kind of thing when he's working, but he had a super short temper and he was known for getting in bar fights, and he frequented bars all the time. He liked to drink, he liked to party, he liked to live the high life, that kind of thing. And he wasn't the kind of person that you would consider like, oh, you're a happy drunk, you're like, oh, you're so fun to be around. He's like, no, he's that angry drunk. He's like, oh, you don't look at me that way, I'm gonna fight you, like that kind of stuff. So he got in a lot of brawls. In terms of like his legal history, he had a lot of like infractions as well. He wasn't really accused of a lot of major crimes. A lot of them were like mostly what we would call today misdemeanors kind of thing. But he did a lot of stuff. Like he was arrested 11 times. Yeah, he was arrested 11 times, like in his adulthood, right? One of the things that I had no idea about until I did a little bit more research this week, because I kind of knew his basic story, was that he had an apartment and he was frustrated with the lack of natural light in his apartment. So he took his sword, because he had a sword. Dude had a sword. He was packing all the time. Okay, he cut a hole in the ceiling of his apartment so that he could get more light coming through, because I guess he was like the top or whatever. Upset his landlord threw him out, so he's homeless for a little bit. I mean, he fell in hard times, right? Today he'd be holding one of those signs like, hey, I'm homeless, got an apartment with natural light, I would love that, right? He actually got in trouble for carrying, I guess this was illegal back then, for open carrying his sword. So I kind of think that's like an open carry problem that we have in America. Kind of interesting how that relates in my mind. So that was one thing he got in trouble for. He got in trouble for, it was called roaming with an unlicensed sword, which I think is wonderful language. Today we'd call it open carry. So one of the times that he got in trouble, let's see, he was, I'm sorry, this is just so tickling to me, that this character. And his work is so beautiful at the same time. It's like, what an interesting person. So he got in trouble for swearing at a constable, okay? So basically cussing out a cop. Right, that's what that would be today, because a constable would be like a person of the law. So if you can imagine, like, just some really reckless, like, not a bad-looking dude, swinging around his sword, like yelling at the police, that kind of guy, right? One of the other times that he got in trouble, he had assaulted a guard that was standing guard at someplace, and I guess he cut him in the face and scarred him. So he got in trouble for that one. It's a little bit of a problem there. At one time, he was at a restaurant, and he became very insulted by the waiter who had brought him a plate of artichokes that he felt were undercooked. So he threw a fit, took the plate, threw it at his waiter, like literally in the face, got kicked out of the restaurant. So he got in trouble for that one too. This guy's so interesting, I'm telling you. Anybody ever heard about the situation where he actually ended up killing a guy? Like that would be his major thing, like his felony. Yes, no, maybe? So this is what drew me to him in the first place when I was in art history, because I was like, wow, I'm just looking at like his work and I'm thinking, wow, this guy's like a straight up killer. So I guess he got into an argument with this guy, right? And some people say it's a gambling argument. Some people said it was like over one of Caravaggio's favorite prostitutes that he hired a lot for modeling. We'll say modeling, okay? We don't know about Caravaggio. He's capable of a lot of things. And so it's either one or the other. Like it was a gambling debt problem, or some people say that this dude that he ended up killing like insulted his like beloved prostitute. So what Caravaggio did was he challenged that guy to a tennis match. Any of this ringing a bell for any of you? Oh man, you're gonna want to research this dude after we're done. He challenged the guy to a tennis match, and a lot of people think the tennis match was like a guy's, like, okay, we're gonna do this tennis match thing, but I'm really just gonna kill you, right? Other people say that it was a legit tennis match that he was trying to like beat him into, like, I don't know, reclaim his honor. He ended up not winning. They got into a fight, and he took out his unlicensed sword and killed the guy, right? So you can't do that. That's illegal, turns out. And so he was, the guy's name was Tomasini. Interestingly, Tomasini was a pimp, okay? So that's, these are the kind of people he hangs out with anyways. At that point, he was issued a death warrant. So he had to leave, right? And so he fled. He went to Naples. He went to Malta, a couple of different places in Italy, right? And he was kind of seeking refuge. He was literally hiding in people's houses. So while he was exiled, he did work quite a bit. I'll probably end up, no, I did show you this. The beheading of St. John the Baptist, no, I did not. But it's another beheading piece. He did a whole bunch of them, but he did one of those during his exile. And it's a large piece. And to think that, he rocked that out while he was hiding from the authorities is kind of interesting. So when he was in Malta, he actually developed a really good reputation for himself. I guess he was on good behavior. We would call that probation today, maybe parole, right? So here he is out on good behavior, but he's still hiding from, the people that had a death sentence on him. He was actually knighted because they were so impressed with his artistic skill. So he became a knight in Malta, right? However, this did not last long. He got into a fight with another knight. Imagine that, right? Unfortunately, the other knight was like higher in rank than him, and that wasn't okay, right? So they stripped him of his knighthood. Then he decided, okay, I'm going to go hide in Sicily. When he hid in Sicily, it's thought that he was ambushed by a group of dudes because they were trying to avenge Tomasini's death, the pimp that he killed. Not a lot of people know completely why, but they totally ambushed him, brought him out into the daylight, right? So what happened during this fight was that they cut his face up kind of in revenge, and he was like permanently disfigured at that point. He didn't do any more self-portraits, is my understanding after that, because he would have painted it very realistically. He had a high fealty to realism, right? So during this time, he was like trying to get in good with the Pope and the Catholic Church again. So he started like just randomly sending his paintings to them and like donating them. Like, see, I can be good. Here's my paintings. It's fine. So he was kind of like hoping that he would basically be exonerated of his of his crimes as such. Interestingly, and this is like way later, okay? I'll talk about his death here in a minute, but interestingly, one of his paintings that there's not a lot of documentation on it now. Apparently in 1969, the Italian mafia, so this is like, 1969, right? they stole one of his paintings from like wherever it was being exhibited, and they kept it in like their big business room, right? And this was like where they conducted all their business. It's like, okay, we're in the mafia, we got to have these like important like hits and things like that. We got to do our painting by this rebel artist. That was kind of like their idea. So when it was discovered, my understanding is the Italian mafia actually destroyed it completely. So there's no record of it anymore. As far as his death, right? There are a couple of different things that people think about how he died. It's debated. I remember when I first did my research, it was syphilis. Everybody said, okay, it's syphilis, right? He's a shady dude. He probably, I don't even know if a thing like protecting yourself was like that back then, but he hung out with a lot of people that could contract syphilis. A lot of people think it was malaria. Some people think that he was murdered out of revenge, right? And I think any of those are probably pretty likely. But in 2010, there were a bunch of scientists and researchers that went and found what they believe are like his actual bones that would be attributed to him, okay? And they did a bunch of like carbon testing and stuff on the bones, and they found a toxic level of lead in his bones, like still, right? Because, metal has a very, very long half-life. So they actually believe, because his habits for painting were, he wasn't like this, he's a painter like he lives life. Like he's one of these guys that was probably like, all over the place. He'd probably like clean up his brushes all over himself or whatever. Maybe he wasn't even using brushes, who knows? So they believe that like his actions, his activity may have made it to where he was absorbing a lot of that lead paint into his bloodstream and his system. And one of the things about like lead poisoning is that it causes brain damage. And so these scientists believe that maybe he was being all crazy and erratic and things like that because his brain wasn't working right, because he was like going crazy, right? Throwing plates of artichokes at waiters and like, calling out people over a game of tennis, just randomly assaulting a senior night kind of thing. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about his, I don't know, could we call it career, his lifestyle, his attitude? Okay, so that's all the crazy stuff that I have to talk about with him. St. Francis, right, the Pope, actually really likes Caravaggio. And he really likes one of the works in particular that he made, the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. So to me, this is classic Caravaggio. I mean, all of these complicated figures in here, this really moody theatrical lighting. We see all this action happening. The figure drawing is just enormously beautiful to me. This painting has actually been in the same church for 400 years. And this is like, we've had world wars since then. And somehow this painting has survived. It's never been loaned out. It's never moved. So it's been kept in really good condition. I found that to be really, really incredible. Couple of other things about him, right? While he was celebrated by the Counter-Reformation Catholics as being this person that could like make art that would really appeal to the masses and pull people back into Catholicism, a lot of them were very critical of the way that he painted and how he came up with, his subject matter and things like that. They didn't like the fact he was using prostitutes to model because they felt like that undermined the stature of these individuals that he's painting. He's painting people like saints, and like Virgin Mary and stuff like that, right? So it seemed really, to them, it seemed really insulting. The other fact that he would, his buddies that he would drink with and all that kind of stuff, they sat and they modeled for him as well. And they would be depicted as saints, things like that. There were a lot of people that, again, were more traditional and probably identified a little bit less with the Counter-Reformation movement, with the Catholicism, that also thought that his reality was too harsh, that things aren't idealized as much as they should be, right? Because he didn't really, you can see that in his work, right? I mean, he didn't make this guy bending down all buff with pectorals, he was honest about what he saw. He painted what he saw. If, like the lute player, right? If that's exactly what he saw, he painted that. So a lot of people were like, not okay. You got to idealize these people because they're important, they're in the Bible, so on and so forth. So that's Caravaggio in a nutshell, and that's Chiaroscuro in a nutshell. I hope you were able to get 5 facts. Dude's really interesting. He was really interesting. research more, man. Tell me stuff. It's always exciting to me when I discover somebody in art history that I learn a lot about their personal life or like their methods and things like that. And I look at their work and I try to like imagine how that can even be a thing, right? You have a homework assignment over the weekend. So you might have some friends that ain't up in here today that are not in class. You might want to let them know that they need to come prepared to class on Monday. You're going to want to take several reference photos of yourself. You need to create very theatrical lighting, kind of a spot lighting, some kind of a moody atmosphere. You need a chiaroscuro effect. It is easiest if you do this with somebody photographing you. I'm going to show you some examples. You can bring more than 5, right? If you have them on your phone, you have an iPhone, you can airdrop them to me, I can print them. If you can get them on a flash drive, you can print them on any of our copiers. If you want to bring in print-offs, that's great too. Just bring all 5 or all however many you do. I've had students bring in 12 or 15. The idea is that we need to pick the most compelling and interesting, the most theatrical chiaroscuro element photograph that's going to be the subject for your self-portrait. We're going to take that 8 by 10, it's going to be 8.5 by 11, right? You want to make it as big as you can on there. And then we're going to amplify that at least 3 times, and we're going to make a very large drawing, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the ones. You'll probably like this. I've done a lot of chiaroscuro drawings. So I'm going to share with you my latest photo shoot. Okay. So I haven't drawn any of these yet. I don't know that I will draw them all. But what I did was I was set up in my classroom. I shut all the lights off, and I had one of my students take my cell phone. Oh, wow. Let's get in there. Yeah, that's going to happen to you when you're 40. You're going to get that nose hair. It's going to be a thing. I probably won't use that one then. Because what would Caravaggio do? He'd actually draw that nose hair. So I'm probably not going to do that. Anyways, I had her take like probably 40 photographs of me. I just moved my head all over like crazy and tried to do fun stuff with it. That one looks pretty fun, kind of a little bit maniacal. But what you're looking for is stuff like uneven shadows on the face, right? That one's, yeah. My granddaughter would like that one, I think. She'd be like, oh, Grandpa's angry. That one's fun. I really like that. I probably am going to do something with that one. I really like how there's not a lot of information over here, just enough detail for me to understand what's happening there. That one's just in there because it's funny. So obviously I'm like opening my eyes or closing my eyes at some point there. I do have plans for this one, actually. This one's pretty fun. So a lot of times when people are drawing themselves, they get worried about like what they look like and they want to idealize. But with this project, that's not what it's about, right? It's about uneven lighting. It's about 3/4. It's not about showing yourself frontal and then going, oh no, my eyes are different shapes, or maybe my nostril holes are different shapes. You're not going to even have to worry or contend with that because you're working with a very dramatic type pose. Can't even look at it, it's funny. So I'm going to show you some examples that students have done in the past. I have discovered a lot about myself, drawing myself over the years. I have discovered that I have a kidney bean shaped nostril on one side and a lima bean shaped nostril on the other. This is normal, don't worry, because I didn't worry. My ears are also a little bit off, like one of them's a little higher than the other, which is why like I got to have my glasses adjusted when I get them from the factory. They're like this. It's a thing. Anybody in here like really familiar with charcoal, or maybe not? Okay, the way I teach charcoal is not like with a whole bunch of grayscale charcoal, like kind of like pan pastels or whatever. You're gonna get black, you're gonna get white. That's it, right? Now this dude's is pretty nice, but he went frontal with it, which I didn't really care for. When he first did this, his drawing style is really interesting actually. When he first did this, he tried not to draw any of this stuff, and I felt like that there was just not enough information there. So he actually went in here and drew over the top of this with white charcoal. So you can do a lot with white charcoal. You're going to be developing your atmosphere to be somewhat addressing the mood that you want to create. If you want to keep a simple thing going on like Caravaggio would, you just go completely black in the atmosphere. But sometimes when you take a photograph, it may lead you to make some different decisions about what you're going to do with that atmosphere. The reason that she left this so light over here was because this in the photograph that she worked from was extremely dark. And it was going to be hard for her to be able to like show those contours and stuff. Same over here, she went with kind of a medium gray because that other side of her face was extremely dark. The light was coming up from here, and that should be extremely obvious when you get your drawing done. We should be able to see what's going on with that. Okay, that other one's not a good example. You know what? I'll show you a non-example. That's not a bad idea. So this guy did not have a good photograph, so don't do this. I don't see any drama, theater, or kind of interesting stuff going on here. To me, it's static, you know? Like in these, there's so much more expression. See what I'm saying? With this one, it's kind of like we don't even really get an emotional feel from this, right? So we want to think more expressively. This is a piece that I did a long time ago. So the stuff that you see on the left-hand side is from a reference that I took a photograph from. And then I decided to try something kind of interesting. So what I did was I made this like weird collage underneath. And I actually took the drawing and I laid some acetate over it and I traced that in Sharpie and then I like shaded with a bunch of other Sharpie colors and I sprayed it with denatured alcohol to get it to run. So it's kind of like a double portrait. I've had a pretty good experience with this piece. I've gotten in a lot of shows. Stay, don't fall down. Okay. This is one that I did a few years ago. I don't know why I made these frames so huge, but they are. You should make smaller frames.